This is Land of Havilah, Esther 9. The king crowned Mordecai. The Jews all across the empire rejoiced that on Adar 13 they would join together and avenge themselves with lethal force when that day arrived, verse 1. Now in the 12th month, which is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the month, when the king's commandment and his decree came near to be put in execution, on the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to conquer them, but it was turned out the opposite happened, that the Jews conquered those who hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who wanted to harm them. No one could withstand them because the fear of them had fallen on all the people. Comment, no one could withstand the Jews that day because the fear of them had fallen on all the people. The fear fell on them because the king's command was upon the Jews to defend and avenge themselves. The question arises, why didn't the king simply reverse Haman's order, but instead order the Jews to defend themselves against the previous order? It seems to be an insane situation for the king to set his people against the Jews and the Jews against his people. He's setting fire to the empire. It's because Haman wrote his order in the king's name and sealed it with the king's ring, chapter 3, verse 12. And according to chapter 8, verse 8, such an order may not be reversed by any man. So not even the king could reverse the order because he was a man, but he could empower the Jews to defend and avenge themselves. This is a teaching about the way God has set up our world, that in times long past, before Lucifer fell, God set Lucifer over the world. The Bible calls him, quote, the God of this world, 2 Corinthians 4:4. Satan couldn't have that authority unless God gave it to him. And God has said, quote, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, Romans 11:29. So Satan's authority is irrevocable since it was a gift of God. Therefore, when Satan fell, and he did, Luke 10:18 and Isaiah 14:12-15, and Christ ascended to power as he did, Matthew 28:18, Christ authorized us with another order in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring, that we should defend ourselves against Satan's kingdom of darkness. That's why God doesn't simply cancel Satan's power over the world, but rather empowers us to resist and avenge ourselves, Ephesians 6:10-18. And it's why Christ said, quote, I came to throw fire on the earth. I wish it were already kindled, Luke 12:49. In other words, Christ came to set fire to his own world that he created by pitting us against Satan. We're not to attack people because, quote, our wrestling's not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world's rulers of the darkness of this age, and against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places, Ephesians 6:12. Once again, God's much too intelligent in this book of Esther or in any of the books of the Bible to simply tell stories for the entertainment of children. There are deeper meanings behind all his narratives. He wrote the narratives so that a person could appreciate them or reject them as he desires, and as God gives him insight or doesn't give him insight. Your narrator believes that the point here in Esther is that God will not strip Satan of his power, which will be a lot simpler, but rather he's empowered us in Christ to defend and avenge ourselves against Satan, as he empowered the Jews in Mordecai to defend and avenge themselves. Getting back to the narrative, verse 3, all the princes of the provinces, the local governors, and those who did the king's business helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. Comment, all the kingdom of heaven and the angels are subject to Christ, therefore they help us. God has shifted the weight of power to us Christians in the fight against the kingdom of darkness. Verse 4, for Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew greater and greater. Comment, for Christ is great in God the king's house. His fame has gone out through all heaven and earth, and, quote, of the increase of his government there shall be no end, Isaiah 9:7. Verse 5, the Jews struck all their enemies with the stroke of the sword and with slaughter and destruction, and did what they wanted to those who hated them. Comment, and for Christians, quote, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us, Romans 8:37. Verse 6, in the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Ariday, and Vezatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemies, but they didn't lay their hand on the plunder. Comment, Christians will prevail over every son of the devil, but we care nothing for the plunder, the things of the world. Quote, don't love the things that are in the world. 1 John 2:15. Verse 11. On that day the number of those who were slain in the citadel of Susa was brought before the king. The king said to Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in the citadel of Susa, including the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your further request? It shall be done. Comment, the king's pleased with the slaughter of the forces of darkness and wants more. Verse 13. Then Esther said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do tomorrow also according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. The king commanded this to be done. A decree was given out in Susa, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. Comment, Haman's sons died already on the 13th. Now Esther will disgrace them on the 14th by hanging their dead bodies on the gallows. Speaking of God the Father, us, and Christ, quote, He made you alive together with him, wiping out the handwriting in ordinances which was against us, and he has taken it out of the way, having stripped the principalities and the powers. He made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. Colossians 2:13-15. Esther made an open show of her enemies on the gallows, and we openly triumph over the principalities and powers of darkness. Verse 15. The Jews who were in Susa gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and killed 300 men in Susa, but they didn't lay their hand on the plunder. The other Jews who were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together, defended their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they didn't lay their hand on the plunder. Comment, as it was open season for the Jews against their enemies, it's now open season for Christians against the forces of darkness, because of the power God has given us. Speaking of the Jews in the provinces and them avenging themselves, verse 17, this was done on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day of that month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled together on the 13th and on the 14th days of the month, and on the 15th day of that month they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who lived in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, a good day and a day of sending presents of food to one another. Comment, the Jews in Susa avenged themselves on the 13th and 14th and celebrated on the 15th. The Jews in unwalled towns avenged themselves on the 13th only and celebrated on the 14th. As the song says for Christians, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. After the celebrations, verse 20, Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both near and far, to enjoin them that they should keep the 14th and 15th days of the month Adar yearly, as the days in which the Jews had rest from their enemies, and the month which was turned to them from sorrow to gladness, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, and of sending presents of food to one another, and gifts to the needy. Comment, Mordecai didn't order the Jews, but rather enjoined them in verse 21 that they should celebrate the 14th of Adar yearly in the outlying areas, and the 15th in the walled cities, as a commemoration, because as it originally happened, the Jews in the outlying areas avenged themselves on the 13th and celebrated the 14th, whereas in Susa they avenged themselves 2 days and celebrated the 15th. Verse 23. The Jews accepted the custom that they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that is, the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when this became known to the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked plan which he had planned against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they call these days Purim, from the word Pur. Comment, as it happened in the book of Esther, Haman cast lots to determine the precise day that he would destroy the Jews. The word for lot was pur. The plural is Purim. The Jews have been celebrating Purim on the 14th and 15th of Adar for the last 2,500 years. In Jerusalem and other ancient walled cities, Purim's the 15th. In all other parts of the world, it's the 14th. On the Gregorian calendar, Purim falls in February or March. Still in verse 26. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and that which had come to them, the Jews established and imposed on themselves and on their descendants, and on all those who joined themselves to them, so that it should not fail that they would keep these 2 days according to what was written, and according to its appointed time every year, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor their memory perish from their offspring. Then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. Comment, the first letter to the Jews was that they should defend and avenge themselves. The second letter was that they should celebrate Purim yearly. And in addition, some Jews fast on the day before Purim to commemorate the Jews' fast before Esther approached the king. It's called the Fast of Esther, verse 30. He sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth to confirm these days of Purim in their appointed times, as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had decreed, and as they had imposed upon themselves and their descendants in the matter of the fastings and their cry. Comment, the Jews fasted before Esther cried to the king. Purim falls into a little bit different category than the previous appointed times. Yahweh commanded in Leviticus 23 that there be 7 yearly appointed times, such as Passover and so forth. But in verse 13 we just read, Purim's something the Jews, quote, imposed upon themselves, end quote. Verse 32. The commandment of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. Comment, what book is that in which the commandment was recorded? It could be Esther, or maybe it was the book of the Chronicles of the Persian Kingdom, which will be mentioned in the next chapter. Esther 10 is next.